Hey guys, we're out in the garage working on this Viscount Vincent CycleKart, doing a little bit of maintenance. So it's been a few years since I've taken this apart and maintained the bearings and all that. So I took all the bearings out, cleaned them all up. They were pretty dirty and grungy from all the dust and dirt, and reassembled them. And just wanted to show you, you don't want any friction in your bearings when you're setting this up. See how that spins pretty freely? If your axle isn't spinning freely, you've got some binding either in your axle bearings or in your braking or your differential or possibly your sprocket if you have your engine and chain installed. It should spin fairly freely. If you see any binding, that leads to problems. It could end up being your torque converter belt could burn up, or you just simply aren't getting the performance you need to. So I'm going to take this bearing apart right now and show you how this goes together. Some of you guys are new to this and thought it might be helpful for you. So these are from Azusa. They're for 1-inch axles. Comes with the flangettes. These are the outer inside and outside. So there's an inside and an outside. You see they're shaped. The bearing itself has these little race in here and these little holes. So I've taken some of this white lithium grease and sprayed it into that little hole, and it bubbles up to these other holes. So makes it nice and smooth operation. It was getting a little dirty and grungy just from 8 years of operation that I've had this CycleKart. I will tell you, and I conferred with my CycleKart friends on the CycleKart North America page, these little grub screws tend to mar up the axle. In fact, it happened on one of them. The grub screw was screwed into the axle and this spun on the axle. It created a channel all the way around it, and then this would not come back off. So I had to literally cut the bearing off of the CycleKart. So to avoid that, my friends are advising me just don't use the grub screws. Either remove them or glue them in with some Loctite so they don't fall out. Removing them seems like the easiest thing so they don't end up in the axle and damaging anything. And then these will be held in place on the CycleKart so they don't slide around using this sort of a clamp. So these are split collars, and they just put them right up against the bearing and lock it down. And that prevents your axles and bearings from sliding back and forth, which is the whole point of those little grub screws. So we want that up against the bearing. We're going to put one on the outside of this bearing as well. And that's going to keep everything from sliding around. So I'll show you how that works in a second. Okay, for this next step, it's helpful to have the engine and the torque converter in place. And also you're going to want to start by measuring, the space of this axle from the bearing. So in this case, it's about 9 inches from, actually it's easier to do it this way, from the front of the axle to some point on the frame where you can pick some place you can repeat on both sides. Check this side, then check the other side, make sure they're even. In this case, I've already done this with my brake, pretty much puts it in the right spot. And then I've got the front part of the torque converter taken off so you can see this easily where the chain goes here. You can see I'm lined up with my sprocket. Now if this is misaligned, this will start throwing belts and things and throwing chains. One trick that I've used in the past to help me line it up, because once you put the torque converter parts all back on, it's a little bit hard to see, and that would be to put a straight edge across either your sprocket on this side or this side. Either way, just help you visualize where the sprocket lines up to make sure this chain is aligned, because when you put the chain in there, it's a little harder to see. It's a little hard to see in the camera that you're perfectly lined up from this sprocket to the other sprocket down here. And if it's a little bit misaligned, it can deal with that, but too much misalignment, you'll throw chains and burn belts and all kinds of bad stuff happens. So the next step is going to be, now that I've got the axle on the right spot, I'm going to kind of systematically go around and tighten one of these at each of these axle bearings to keep it from sliding back and forth right and left. And then what we'll do is we'll put Loctite on these so that they don't come out. So I have removed all my little grub screws here. And this should turn fairly easily on the axle. This is a little bit tight because I've moved it around, but everything still spins loose easily with no problems. So that's looking pretty good. So I'm gonna get some Loctite and put these in. And what we'll do is we'll alternate where these are sitting at. May not matter much, but you put these facing up, you put the next ones facing down. In theory, we're balancing it, right? I laugh because CycleKarts really aren't balanced hardly ever at all. But this is hopefully just giving you some helpful hints. So I did lubricate those bearings so they spin nice and freely now. And when they're brand new, they don't really need to be lubricated, but after the use for a few years, they do need to be lubricated. And with this differential, you're going to make sure that you don't have any binding. If it's binding, because these axles are separate right from right to left. With a solid axle, it's not that big a deal. It's pretty it finds its center pretty easily as far as alignment. Okay, so next up is installing the hubs. Now these are the VKC hubs, and they're slightly different than what Mark is making at Renegade. I am required because of the way that my particular differential or the axle is made. I need these extra little spacers in here for the bolt because this is so far recessed in there. Anyway, that's what's required for this particular car. And I've got a marked driver's side, and this other one's obviously the passenger side. And I put a little lubricant, a little bit of this stuff. This is the same stuff I put in the bearings. You could use some axle grease. Really just trying to keep this from getting, fusing and rusting inside of there. Keep it dirt out and keep it from rusting. We want these really removable. They can fuse the axle because there's some steel and steel. If it rusts in there, it makes it hard to take apart. So anyway, we've got our little keyway here and our nut and ready to install it. Okay, so we'll start our assembly over here with our keyway. It's just going to go on your axle. And try to hold the phone while I do all this. Hopefully this goes straight on there. Of course, we're going to line up our keyway with the keyway there. Slide it on. It should bottom out. A little bit of grease came out of there when I did that, so that's fine. Wipe that off. We don't want a lot of grease on the threads because we're going to be doing some Loctite on there. We want the threads to lock so they bolt doesn't come off. So get that out of the way. Okay, so that's on there now. And this is keyed, so if you weren't keying this, you would leave the key out, you would leave this out. You could put a nut or a grease thread in this if you wanted to. For example, if this was going to be a free-floating axle on a solid axle, if you're only keying one side. If you key both sides, it's really great for performance, but not so good for turning at slow speeds. So this keys the axle to the hub. Okay, so this hub turns with the axle. Makes sense? Pretty simple. Okay, so our next is our washers and then our nut. Now I'm not going to be able to tighten this nut while holding the camera, so I'll tighten that up real quick. Okay, the hub is secured. This is a 1 1/16 inch wrench. You have a socket that would work better. I forgot to mention earlier that you do want to secure the axle somehow. If the engine's not attached, you'll need vice grips to hold onto the axle while you turn that nut. Now, if this is a nylock nut, and I noticed as I was putting this on, it was really easy to put on, which tells me that these nylocks is pretty well worn out. So I want to replace those before I proceed, but I wanted to show you how this goes together. This is basically assembled. Next step would be to Loctite this little screw here. Loctite this, and this is what this does, is secures your keyway from coming out. Now you don't have to have this as long as this never fails. You can even use a zip tie here. All this does right here is keep this keyway from sliding out. So this isn't really even 100% necessary. I happen to have one on here, so I'm going to reuse it, but I will Loctite these first so they don't slide around. But that hub is installed, so I'll repeat the process on the other side. Okay, so the hubs are both on, both sides. I got my locking collars on there. And I've got Loctite in this little grub screw there. Loctite on all the locking collars. And these are all snugged down nice and tight. And I went and got new bolts, or nuts rather, for these outside hubs so that these have solid, brand new nylocks so that they went on a little tighter. That should keep it from loosening up. If that loosens up, your wheel will tend to wobble on here. That can wear out your axle, wear out your hub. Okay, so next thing is to put the wheel on. So again, these are going to be nylocks on the back side, so we'll slide these things on here. Okay, so the wheel is just loosely on here, and I've got my washers and nylocks on the back. So as you go around, you're going to want to do crisscross, so kind of slowly tighten this up onto the hub. You don't want to go just tighten all, really tight on one end, because it could put the wheel out of balance. So you want to tighten these all four, just like a regular car wheel, where you want to mix up or crisscross the pattern of your bolting. So you're going to snug them all down finger tight, and then tighten this one, tighten that one, tighten this one, tighten that one, and vice versa. So kind of all the way around the hub until you get it all snugged down. Okay, so I used my Ryobi ratchet to kind of, get it close, and then I used a hand ratchet to get it the rest of the way. There's no real torque spec on these, just snug. You don't want to over-torque them because you could break your bolts. Something important with nylocks, you want to make sure there's 2 threads showing past the bolt, or past the nut head. That way you can tell right away if this thing's loosening up or not. That is what we're looking for at Huntsville, by the way. I've seen some bolts that are just flush with the nut, and that's probably a little bit of a safety issue. I talked to Mark Parnell about it. I said, yeah, 2 threads past the nylock part of this nut, And again, nylocks, not lock washers and regular nuts. Anything that spins and vibrates, those things will come loose. So the nylocks seem to be really good. I've never had one loosen up in all the years I've run CycleKart. So we'll go ahead and throw the other wheel on and get this thing back on the ground. Okay, so this is just for visualization purposes. Again, I've got my torque converter disassembled, but I got my chain sitting here, and I'm ready to put the chain together. So typically I put it from the back side, because I'm normally working on it from the outside of the car, because it's easier to get to. Do this with one hand. Oh, of course I drop it. So I picked it up. So doing this with one hand is sometimes a bit of a challenge. I'll get started on one and try to feed it through the other. Okay, there we go. Now it's through. And of course you got your, you should know how to do this, but real basically, you put this little other part of the chain part on there. Your master link. Okay, so I got that part on there. So the next part is this little deal here. And what you want to do is put this on with the round part toward the front of the car, because this is the direction of travel, right? So it spins this direction, and you want the round part forward, so if it gets thrown off by the force of the chain, it's not likely to get thrown off. It's going to, if you put it this way, for example, the chain lurches forward, this could, kind of stay back and pop off. So I always put the round part in the direction, forward in the direction of travel. So I'll pop this on. I'm going to go grab a screwdriver. I definitely will need two hands for that, but you just put it in between there and then snap it on with a screwdriver or a pair of pliers. Okay, so that's snapped right on. The removal is just the opposite. So you just take your screwdriver, if you've never done this before, and just kind of pry that forward this way, and it should pop off. And this will kind of spring out of there and disappear into the ether. So I always keep a few extras in my workbench or in my bag. Get that to focus, sorry. I keep a few of these extra master links. Folks tend to break these and lose these at track events if their axle slides around. So we'll align the chain once I put all this back together. But for, you just want this to be snug. You don't want it to be so tight that you can't move it. You have to have a little bit of movement in it. So right about there is probably pretty good. This would be snug. This would have a little bit of movement in it. So you don't want it so tight that it can't move, because that causes binding and that hurts performance, and it could, snap your chain. And of course, when you're doing it, you want to make sure it's all aligned. As you look down, try to visualize between your sprocket and here, and get your motor as square in there as you possibly can. So anyway, this is just to illustrate kind of how that all gets together. Where I've seen guys have struggles with these things, getting alignment, getting the axle to work right, tending to throw the chain off and also burn up the drive belt. So hopefully this information was helpful to you in your CycleKart adventures. We'll be putting out some more tech videos as we go along, as I think of more things to do. If you have some questions, feel free to leave a comment. It'll give me an idea on a video I can do to help you out. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the subscriptions and the likes and questions. Get out in the garage and build something cool.